Hello, I'm Alison Leslie. I'm a map assistant at the National Library of Scotland. For those of you researching D-Day, this talk will introduce you to the Mulberry Harbours and their vital role in the final months of the Second World War. What links Scotland with mulberries, Wales, gooseberries, hippos, beetles and Swiss rolls? Swiss rolls, gooseberries and hippos were all parts of the prefabricated Mulberry Harbours that were towed across the Channel as part of the D-Day fleet and constructed in situ on Gold and Omaha beaches. Scotland played a large part in the production and testing of the Mulberry Harbours. More than 100 Scottish firms sent over 30,000 tonnes of steelwork and machinery to Normandy, with 83% of the pierheads being supplied from 3 sites in Scotland. 2 of the Scottish firms involved were the Renfrew-based specialist dredger firm of Lobnitz and Company and Alexander Findlay & Co. of Motherwell. Findlay's also had a yard at Leith, where 13 spud pierheads and 16 beetle pontoons were built. 3 pierheads were based at Cairnryan by the Port Construction and Repair Companies. The Cairnryan pierheads had their legs fitted at Faslane, while those manufactured in Leith had their legs fitted at Southampton. With steel in short supply, switching from riveting to the relatively new technology of welding helped to save considerable amounts of metal. In May 1942, Winston Churchill issued a memo relating to piers for use on beaches, which started the whole project. The reasoning behind these piers was to save lives and equipment which would otherwise be lost in the fight for already damaged or destroyed harbours and quaysides. By the autumn of 1942, specifications had been issued for pierheads and piers required. Each harbour was to be roughly the size of Dover Harbour, with a proposed life of 100 days. When at full capacity, each harbour would be capable of handling 12,000 tonnes of stores and 2,500 vehicles per day. By the 10th of June, D+4, an area of sheltered water would be established, and by the 20th of June, D+14, the harbours would be capable of receiving ships. The date for the start of the trials was set for May 1943. The testing for these harbours was done in Wigton Bay at Garliston. Garliston was one of the many sites around Britain linked to the Mulberry Harbours, and the only one where extensive sea trials took place. Despite German spy planes flying over Wigtown Bay, the importance of the area was never realised. Garliston was chosen as the test centre for 4 reasons. There was reasonable access to beaches with a similar rise and fall tide pattern to the Normandy beaches, as well as having occasional rough seas. Garliston is a remote area away from the centres of population. Garliston is ideally placed to accept equipment by rail or sea. The bay was not already being used by the military. Where possible, official photographs from the Imperial War Museum will be used to show what the different parts of the Mulberries looked like. Each Mulberry Harbour consisted of different structures joined together. Bombardons were floating outward breakwater, one of the breakwater elements. Gooseberries were static outer breakwater elements consisting of scuttled ships. Phoenix were large concrete caissons sunk as part of the breakwater. Beetle was a floating pontoon support for the whale. Whale was a floating pierhead and roadway. Spud was a floating pierhead on adjustable legs. Gooseberries provided a sheltered breakwater. 59 merchant ships were identified and taken to Rosyth, Methil and Oban to be converted. The Armada gathered at Oban, before sailing to Normandy and being scuttled after the D-Day landings. After the gooseberries were in place, phoenixes were constructed. These large concrete caissons of different sizes were sunk to form part of the breakwater with the gooseberries. Then it was the turn of the adjustable floating pierheads or spuds. The spuds' adjustable legs could be adjusted depending on the tide. Lobnitz and Company in Renfrew assisted in producing the spud, but their yard did not have the capacity for fabrication. 6 miles of wheels connected the spuds to land. Hippos were the concrete caissons that formed part of the Hughes Pier, one of 3 prototypes tested for the Mulberry Harbours. Crocodiles, constructed of tubular steel, were then laid on top of the hippo to create a roadway. This photo shows the prototypes at their test site. Each Beetle required a good deal of steel for its construction. The design was adapted to enable it to be constructed from steel and reinforced concrete due to the lack of skilled welders and the shortage of steel. The legs could be adjusted according to sea conditions to provide strong bridging sections for the floating roadways. Tests and trials of the Beetles took place between the autumn of 1943 and the spring of 1944 in Wigtown Bay. During an early towing test, 6 Beetles were lost when the tow rope snapped. The remains of 7 Beetles are now protected as a designated scheduled monument by Historic Environment Scotland. The Swiss rolls were floating roadways with hinged sides to prevent water swamping the surface. They were constructed of wooden planks held together by steel cables. The first hinged sides were made from canvas. The sides raised themselves as the vehicle drove along. The Swiss rolls were cheap and easy to manufacture with very little input from skilled workers. 2,000 feet of Swiss roll was used at Arromanches for getting troops ashore. Due to the relatively flimsy construction, vehicles could only drive over them in low gear very slowly and not weigh over 7 tons. The Swiss rolls were stored and transported rolled up on huge tubes, rolled out when they were in place. Once constructed, the different parts of the Mulberries were floated south to be held at various points along the south coast of England to wait for Operation Neptune to launch. Elements of the Mulberries began their slow journey to their assembly point 5 kilometres off the French coast on the 4th of June 1944, D-2. By the 7th of June, D+1, the preparatory work had been completed, enabling the separate parts to come together to form 2 Mulberry Harbours. Mulberry A was used by the American forces at Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer on the easy sector of Omaha Beach. 6 miles to the east, Mulberry B was used by British troops at Arromanches on Gold Beach. A storm on the 18th of June damaged both Mulberries, with Mulberry A being damaged beyond repair. Damage to Mulberry B was repaired using whatever was salvageable from Mulberry A over 4 days and 4 nights, during which unloading of supplies continued. With building materials at a premium, many of the girders from the spuds were used to repair damaged and destroyed French bridges. Some of the phoenixes were refloated and towed to Walcheren to repair war damage to the dykes. Remains of components that did not make the journey across to France can still be found along England's south coast. Remains of Mulberry B can still be found on Gold Beach. Their position is marked on the UK Hydrographic Office Wrecks and Obstructions database. The final 3 aerial photographs were taken to check on the accuracy of the bombardment which preceded the landings. This shows the results of RAF Bomber Command's 4th group bombardment just before H hour. I hope this talk has illustrated the part the Mulberry Harbours played in the last months of the Second World War.